The sound of splintering wood made Grace Zimmerman drop the bucket of water she'd been carrying from the creek, her heart hammering as she turned to see three men riding away from her cabin, their laughter carrying back on the hot July wind that swept through Downieville, California in the summer of 1872. She ran toward the small structure she'd called home for the past 8 months, her boots kicking up dust on the hard, packed earth, and felt her stomach drop when she saw what they'd done. The door hung at a sickening angle, one hinge completely torn from the weathered frame, the other bent and useless. The lock she'd saved 3 months to buy lay in pieces on the ground, brass catching the late afternoon sunlight like scattered coins. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She was 22 years old, alone on the edge of town, and now she didn't even have a door that closed. The men had been part of the group that hung around the saloon, the ones who'd made comments when she walked to the general store, who'd asked why a woman like her was living alone, who'd suggested she needed a man to take care of her. She'd ignored them, kept her head high, worked her job at the boarding house cooking and cleaning, minded her own business. But ignoring them hadn't made them go away. Grace knelt and picked up one of the broken pieces of the lock, the metal still warm from the sun. Her hands shook as she examined the damage to the door frame. The wood was old, dry, splitting in places she hadn't noticed before. Even if she could afford another lock, she wasn't sure the frame would hold it, and she couldn't afford another lock. Every penny she earned went toward food, toward keeping the roof over her head, toward the hope that maybe someday she'd have something more than this. She was still kneeling there, staring at the destruction, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Grace scrambled to her feet, her heart racing again, wondering if the men had come back to finish what they'd started. But when she turned, shading her eyes against the sun, she saw only one rider tall in the saddle, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his whole life on horseback, and as he came closer, Grace could make out his features. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of green in his sun-weathered face. He wore dusty trail clothes and a hat that had seen better days, but there was something solid about him, something that made her instinctively take a step back rather than run. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep, respectful. "Saw what happened from up on the ridge. Those men rode past me heading toward town, laughing about something. Didn't sit right with me, so I came to check." Grace looked at him warily, her hand still clutching the broken piece of lock. "I don't know you. Name's Keegan Quaid," he said. "Just came into Downieville yesterday, looking for work. I'm a carpenter by trade, though I've done just about everything else too." He looked past her at the damaged door, and his jaw tightened. "That's a shameful thing, breaking a woman's door. You got family in town who can help." "No," Grace said quietly. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it meant. "No family, no husband, no one." Keegan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You'll have a lock and a home before night, I promise you that." Grace stared at him, uncertain whether to believe this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere, making promises he had no reason to keep. "I can't pay you. I don't have money for repairs." "Didn't ask for money," Keegan said simply. He turned back to his pack mule and began unloading tools, a worn leather bag that clinked with the sound of nails and hinges and other hardware. "Every person deserves to feel safe in their own home. That's not something you should have to pay for." Before Grace could respond, before she could protest or question or do anything but stand there in shock, Keegan had carried his tools to her doorway and was examining the damage with the practiced eye of someone who knew wood and construction. He ran his hand along the frame, testing the strength of the surrounding structure, then looked back at her. "Frame's pretty far gone," he said. "But I can reinforce it, replace the hinges, get you a door that'll hold. I've got a lock in my supplies that'll work better than that one anyway. Brought it from Sacramento, thinking I might need it somewhere. Seems like here's where it belongs." Grace found her voice finally, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Keegan met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not the predatory look she'd grown accustomed to from other men, but something gentler, something that looked like understanding. Because 8 years ago, my mother lived alone in a cabin outside Virginia City after my father died in the mines. And one night, men broke her door and there was nobody to help her. By the time I got there the next day, she was so scared she couldn't stop shaking. We left that night, went to live with my sister in Sacramento, but I never forgot the look in her eyes, the way she kept staring at that broken door like it had broken something in her too. The story settled between them, and Grace felt something shift in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be sorry," Keegan said. "Just let me fix your door." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as Keegan went to work, his movements efficient and sure. He pulled off his hat, revealing hair damp with sweat, and rolled up his sleeves. The muscles in his forearms flexed as he began removing what was left of the old hinges, carefully extracting the bent nails from the wood. "What's your name?" he asked as he worked, not looking at her, giving her the space to answer or not. "Grace Zimmerman." "Good to meet you, Miss Zimmerman, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Grace found herself relaxing slightly, watching him work. There was something calming about the steady rhythm of his movements, the quiet competence with which he approached the task. "You said you just got to Downieville yesterday. Where are you coming from?" "Been traveling for the past 6 months, Keegan said, measuring a piece of wood he'd pulled from his supplies. "Working here and there, taking whatever jobs I could find. Sacramento got too crowded for my liking. Too many people, not enough honest work. Heard they were still pulling gold out of the rivers up here, thought maybe I could find something steady." "There's work if you know where to look," Grace said. "The sawmill's always hiring. And there are claims that need working if you don't mind partnering with someone. I'll keep that in mind." Keegan began cutting the wood, and Grace marveled at how he seemed to have everything he needed right there in his pack. "What brought you to Downieville?" It was Grace's turn to be quiet. She watched the sun sinking lower toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I was born in San Francisco," she said finally. "My parents died when I was young, yellow fever. I was raised in an orphanage until I was old enough to work. I was a maid in a hotel there for a while, but the man who owned it started making suggestions about other services I could provide. When I refused, he fired me. I heard there were jobs up here, places where a woman could work honest and be left alone. Turned out the being left alone part was harder than I thought." Keegan stopped his work and looked at her, really looked at her, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's no easy road you've walked." "No," Grace agreed, "but it's mine. I chose it every step. That's worth something." "It's worth everything," Keegan said quietly. Then he turned back to his work, and Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she didn't quite have a name for. The sun continued its descent as Keegan worked, and Grace found herself unable to just stand and watch. She went inside the cabin and began preparing what little food she had, a meager offering, but the only way she knew to thank someone for kindness. She had beans and a bit of salt pork, some cornmeal that could make johnnycakes. She built up her fire and set to cooking, listening to the sounds of hammering and sawing from outside. When she emerged with 2 tin plates of food, Keegan had made remarkable progress. The door frame had been reinforced with new wood, fitted so carefully that it looked like it had always been there. New hinges gleamed in the fading light, and the door itself, which had been rehung temporarily, now sat straight and true in its frame. "It's not quite finished," Keegan said, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Still need to attach the lock and make sure everything's secure, but we're getting there." "You should eat," Grace said, offering him one of the plates. "It's not much, but you've been working for hours." Keegan hesitated, then took the plate with a nod of thanks. They sat on the 2 chairs Grace had outside her cabin, eating in companionable silence as the light faded from the sky. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd shared a meal with someone, the last time the evening hadn't felt so terribly lonely. "This is good," Keegan said, scraping up the last of the beans with a piece of johnnycake. "Thank you." "It's me who should be thanking you," Grace said. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "You would have figured something out," Keegan said. "You seem like the kind of person who always does." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she collected their plates and took them inside to wash. When she came back out, Keegan was working on the door again, using the light from the lantern she'd hung by the entrance. His shadow stretched long across the ground, and Grace watched his hands as they fitted the lock into place, testing it, adjusting it, making sure it was perfect. The stars were beginning to appear overhead when Keegan finally stepped back and tested the door one last time. It swung open smoothly, closed with a solid thunk, and the lock clicked into place with a sound that Grace felt in her bones. Security. Safety. The promise that tonight at least she could sleep without fear. "There," Keegan said, satisfaction in his voice. "You'll have a lock and a home before night, I promised you that." Grace stepped forward and touched the door, running her hand over the smooth wood, the solid hinges, the strong lock. Her throat felt tight with emotion she didn't know how to express. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," Keegan said. He began gathering his tools, packing them back into his bag with the same care he'd used in unpacking them. "I'm just glad I could help." "Where are you staying?" Grace asked suddenly. "You said you just got to town yesterday." "Been camping up in the trees," Keegan said. "It's not so bad, I've slept in worse places." Grace thought about the cabin behind her, the single room with its small bed and fireplace, the space that was hers and hers alone. She thought about this man who'd stopped everything to help her, who'd asked for nothing in return, who'd kept his promise. She thought about the look in his eyes when he'd told her about his mother, the understanding there, the kindness. "There's a barn behind the boarding house where I work," Grace said carefully. "It's not used much anymore, just storage mostly, but there's a loft up top with some old hay. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, she's a good woman. I could ask her if you could stay there until you find proper lodging. It would be better than sleeping on the ground." Keegan looked at her, surprised. "You do that? You fixed my door," Grace said simply. "It's the least I can do." A slow smile spread across Keegan's face, and Grace felt her heart do something strange in her chest. "I'd appreciate that very much, Miss Zimmerman." "Grace," she said. "You can call me Grace. Then you should call me Keegan." They stood there in the gathering darkness, looking at each other, and Grace felt something shift in the world around them, some subtle change in the air that made everything feel different, full of possibility. "I should go see Mrs. Patterson now," Grace said, "before it gets too late." "Would you want to come with me?" "I would," Keegan said. He loaded his tools back onto the pack mule, then fell into step beside Grace as they walked toward the center of Downieville. The town was small, just a main street with a scattering of buildings clustered along the Yuba River. Lamplight glowed in windows, and Grace could hear music and voices from the saloon as they passed. She saw the men who'd broken her door standing outside, and she felt Keegan tense beside her, saw his hand drift toward the gun at his hip. "Don't," Grace said quietly. "It'll only make things worse." Keegan's jaw was tight, but he nodded and kept walking. One of the men called out something crude, and Grace felt her face burn with shame, but she kept her head high and didn't respond. She felt rather than saw Keegan turn and look back at them, something hard and dangerous in his gaze that made the laughter cut off abruptly. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a two-story structure painted white, with a wide porch and flower boxes in the windows. Grace led Keegan around to the back, where Mrs. Patterson was sitting in her kitchen, darning socks by candlelight. "Grace, child, what are you doing here so late?" Mrs. Patterson looked up, her weathered face creasing with concern. She was in her 60s, a widow who'd run the boarding house for 20 years, and she'd been kinder to Grace than anyone else in Downieville. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Keegan Quaid. He's new to town, and he helped me with something today. I was wondering if he might be able to stay in the barn loft for a few days until he finds work and proper lodging. I'll vouch for him." Mrs. Patterson looked Keegan up and down with the sharp eye of someone who'd seen all kinds of men pass through her doors. "What kind of help did you provide my Grace?" "Some men broke her door this afternoon," Keegan said quietly. "I repaired it for her." Mrs. Patterson's expression darkened. "Those fools from the saloon. I heard them talking about it earlier, thought it was just whiskey talk." "Grace, are you all right?" "I am now," Grace said. "Thanks to Keegan." Mrs. Patterson studied Keegan for another long moment, then nodded. "The loft's yours for as long as you need it, Mr. Quaid." Any man who'd help Grace without asking for payment is welcome under my roof, even if that roof is technically a barn. There's a pump out back for washing, and you can take your meals here with the other boarders for a reasonable price." "Thank you, madam," Keegan said. "I appreciate your kindness." "Don't make me regret it," Mrs. Patterson said, but there was warmth in her voice. "Grace, you walk carefully going home. Those men were pretty well liquored up earlier." "I'll walk her back," Keegan said immediately. Mrs. Patterson nodded her approval, and Grace led Keegan out to the barn. It was a solid structure, well-maintained like everything Mrs. Patterson owned. The loft was reached by a ladder, and Grace climbed up to show him the space. It was dusty but dry, with old hay piled in one corner and a small window that looked out over the town. "It's not much," Grace said. "It's perfect," Keegan replied. "Better than I had any right to expect." They climbed back down, and Keegan settled his mule in one of the stalls, making sure the animal had water and feed. Then he walked Grace back through the darkened streets to her cabin. The night was cool, the air carrying the scent of pine from the mountains, and Grace felt acutely aware of Keegan's presence beside her, the quiet strength of him. When they reached her cabin, Grace turned to face him. The new door stood solid and strong in the moonlight, a testament to Keegan's skill and kindness. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You're welcome," Keegan said. He hesitated, then added, "Grace, those men who broke your door, I don't like the thought of them bothering you again." "They probably won't," Grace said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. "They were just trying to scare me." "They succeeded," Keegan said quietly. "I could see it in your eyes when I first rode up." Grace couldn't deny it, so she didn't try. "I'll be more careful." "I'll be at the boarding house if you need anything," Keegan said. "Anytime, day or night, you understand?" Grace nodded, feeling that strange warmth in her chest again. "I understand." Keegan tipped his hat to her, then turned and walked back toward town. Grace watched him go, then went inside her cabin and closed the door. The lock clicked into place with that solid, reassuring sound, and Grace leaned against the door for a long moment, her eyes closed, letting herself feel safe for the first time in months. The next morning, Grace woke early as always and made her way to the boarding house to start her day's work. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink when she arrived, and she was surprised to see Keegan already up, standing by the pump washing his face and hands. "Morning," he said when he saw her, water dripping from his hair. "Morning," Grace replied, suddenly self-conscious about her worn dress and the way she'd hastily pinned up her hair. "You're up early." "Habit," Keegan said. "I wanted to get to the sawmill when they open, see about that work you mentioned." "The foreman's name is Dutch Hendricks," Grace said. "Tell him I sent you. He takes his meals here sometimes. He's a fair man." "I'll do that," Keegan said. "Thank you." They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then Grace heard Mrs. Patterson calling from inside and excused herself. As she worked through the morning, cooking breakfast for the boarders and cleaning the rooms, Grace found her thoughts drifting to Keegan more often than they should. She wondered if he'd gotten the job at the sawmill, wondered when she'd see him again, wondered why it mattered so much. She had her answer at lunchtime when Keegan appeared in the boarding house dining room with Dutch Hendricks himself, both men laughing about something. Grace was serving stew to the other boarders, and she felt Keegan's eyes on her as she moved through the room. "Grace," Dutch called out. "This man says you sent him to me. I'm glad you did. Best carpenter I've talked to in months. You know he worked on the new bank building in Sacramento." "I didn't know that," Grace said, glancing at Keegan. Keegan shrugged. "It was just a job." "Well, it's a job here too, and a good one," Dutch said. "Starting tomorrow if you're willing." "I'm willing," Keegan said. Grace served them both stew, and when she set Keegan's bowl in front of him, their hands brushed briefly. The contact sent a jolt through Grace that she felt all the way to her toes. Keegan's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Keegan worked at the sawmill during the day, cutting lumber and building whatever Dutch needed built. He took his meals at the boarding house, where Grace cooked and served. They would talk in the evenings sometimes, sitting outside the barn or on the chairs by Grace's cabin, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Grace learned that Keegan had grown up in Virginia City, that his father had been killed in a mining accident when Keegan was 17, that he'd taught himself carpentry, because it was the only trade that made sense to him, creating things instead of destroying them. She learned that he'd been briefly engaged once, to a woman in Sacramento, but she'd broken it off when she realized he'd never be content staying in one place forever. Keegan learned that Grace had spent her childhood dreaming of a home of her own, a place that belonged to her and no one else. He learned that she could read, which was unusual for someone of her background, because one of the nuns at the orphanage had taken pity on her and taught her. He learned that she had a beautiful voice and sometimes sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her before she died. They were becoming friends, Grace told herself. That was all. But she couldn't ignore the way her heart sped up when she saw Keegan approaching, or the way her skin tingled when he accidentally touched her hand, or the way she found herself looking for excuses to be near him. One evening in late August, Grace was sitting outside her cabin mending a dress when Keegan appeared, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I made you something," he said, looking almost shy. Grace set aside her sewing. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Keegan said. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a beautiful wooden box, about the size of a book with intricate carvings on the lid, flowers and vines intertwined in a pattern that must have taken hours to create. "I noticed you didn't have anywhere to keep your things safe. Thought you might like this." Grace took the box with trembling hands, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the delicate carvings. "Keegan, this is beautiful. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." "It has a lock too," Keegan said, showing her the small key, "so you can keep your private things private." Grace looked up at him, and the expression on his face made something crack open in her chest. "Why are you so good to me?" Keegan was quiet for a long moment. The sun was setting behind him, painting him in gold and shadow. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who deserves all the good things this world has to offer, and I want to be part of giving you those things. Because when I fixed your door that first day, and I saw the way you looked at me with hope and fear and uncertainty all mixed together, something shifted in me. Because I think about you all the time, Grace. From the moment I wake up until I go to sleep, and even then, you're in my dreams." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. "Keegan, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keegan said. "I just wanted you to know I'm not trying to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore." Grace set the box down carefully on the chair beside her and stood up. She took a step toward Keegan, then another, until she was standing right in front of him. She could see the rapid pulse at his throat, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I think about you too," she said softly. "All the time. I try not to because it scares me, this feeling. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Keegan reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid against her skin. "Does it scare you right now?" "Yes," Grace whispered, "but in a good way." Keegan smiled, and then he was kissing her, gentle and careful like she was something precious. Grace melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. The kiss was everything she'd imagined and nothing like she'd expected, sweet and hot and perfect. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Keegan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm in love with you, Grace Zimmerman. I think I have been since the moment I saw you standing there with that broken lock in your hand, looking like you were ready to fight the whole world if you had to." "I'm in love with you too," Grace said, and saying the words out loud made them feel more real, more true. "I don't know how it happened so fast, but I am." They stood there holding each other as the stars came out overhead, and Grace felt something settle in her soul, something that felt like coming home. After that night, everything changed and nothing changed. They were still themselves, still careful about propriety because small towns talked and Grace couldn't afford to lose her reputation. But now, when they sat together in the evenings, Keegan would hold her hand. Now when he walked her home, he would kiss her goodnight at her door, long, slow kisses that left Grace dizzy and wanting more. Now when she served him meals at the boarding house, they would exchange looks that made Mrs. Patterson chuckle and shake her head knowingly. The men who had broken Grace's door left her alone now. Word had spread that she had someone looking out for her, and Keegan had made it clear to anyone who would listen that anyone who bothered Grace would answer to him. Grace should have resented needing that protection, should have been angry that it took a man's presence to make other men leave her in peace. But she was too practical to indulge in that anger. The world was what it was, and she was grateful for Keegan's presence in her life, grateful for the safety and the love he offered so freely. In September, Dutch Hendricks offered Keegan a permanent position as the sawmill's head carpenter, with a salary that would allow him to rent a proper house. Keegan accepted, but that evening when he told Grace, he looked troubled. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. They were sitting by the creek behind her cabin, watching the water flow past, golden in the evening light. "I don't want to live in town," Keegan said. "I don't want to be apart from you anymore. These past months, having you close by, seeing you every day, it's made me realize that wherever you are, that's where I want to be." Grace's heart was racing. "What are you saying?" Keegan turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm saying marry me, Grace. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my days making you happy, keeping you safe, loving you the way you deserve to be loved." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Keegan, I'll marry you." Keegan let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and crying at the same time. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, and Grace felt like the whole world had suddenly expanded, full of light and possibility. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Downieville, with Mrs. Patterson and Dutch Hendricks standing as witnesses. Grace wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, cream-colored calico with lace at the collar that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson's own daughter. Keegan wore a new suit that Dutch had helped him pick out in Sacramento, dark wool that made his green eyes even more striking. The ceremony was simple, but to Grace it felt like the most important moment of her entire life. When Keegan slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he'd saved for months to buy, Grace felt like she finally understood what home meant. Not a place, but a person. Not walls and a door, but arms that held her and a heart that loved her. They spent their wedding night in Grace's cabin, and Grace discovered that being with Keegan was like everything else between them, natural and right and perfect. He was gentle with her, patient with her nervousness, and when they finally came together, it felt like two pieces of a puzzle sliding into place. "I love you," Keegan whispered in the darkness, his arms around her, her head resting on his chest. "I'm going to love you for the rest of my life, Grace Quaid." Grace Quaid, her new name. She tested it silently in her mind and found she loved the sound of it. "I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone." The next day, Keegan moved his few possessions from the barn to Grace's cabin, and they began their life together. It was a small life by some standards, but to Grace, it felt infinitely rich. Keegan would leave for work at the sawmill each morning, and Grace would continue her job at the boarding house. They would meet for lunch when they could, and in the evenings they would cook dinner together, talking about their days, making plans for the future. Keegan wanted to build them a bigger house someday, he said. Something with multiple rooms, a proper kitchen, maybe even a second floor. Grace wanted to save enough money to start a small business, maybe a restaurant or a boarding house of her own. They dreamed together, planned together, built their future one conversation at a time. In November, Grace realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Keegan. She chose a quiet evening when they were sitting by the fire, Keegan working on carving a new piece of furniture and Grace mending his work shirts. "Keegan," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up immediately, hearing something in her tone. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Grace said. "In the spring, I think, maybe April or May." Keegan stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he carefully set down his carving and crossed to her, kneeling in front of her chair and taking her hands. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Grace said. A huge smile broke across Keegan's face and Grace saw tears in his eyes. "We're going to have a baby. Grace, we're going to be parents." "We are," Grace said, laughing at his reaction. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Keegan said. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully like she was made of glass. "I'm going to be a father. We're going to be a family." That night, Keegan lay with his hand on Grace's still flat stomach, talking to the baby that was growing there, making promises about the kind of father he would be, the kind of life he would give this child. Grace listened, her heart so full she thought it might burst, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The winter was hard that year. Snow fell heavy in the mountains, and the Uber River froze along its edges. The sawmill slowed down and money got tight. But Grace and Keegan managed, pooling their resources, helping each other, never losing sight of the life they were building. Grace's pregnancy progressed normally, though she was often tired and sick in the mornings. Mrs. Patterson fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate enough and didn't work too hard. Keegan became even more protective, walking her to and from work every day regardless of the weather, making sure she was warm and comfortable. In February, Keegan started building a cradle. He worked on it every evening, carefully shaping each piece of wood, fitting them together with the precision and love of a master craftsman. Grace would watch him work, marveling at his skill, at the care he put into every detail. "This baby is going to be so loved," she said one evening. Keegan looked up and smiled. "This baby is going to know every single day that they're wanted, that they're cherished, that they have parents who would do anything for them. That's a promise." The cradle was finished in March, just as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared in the mountains. Keegan had carved flowers into the headboard, the same pattern he'd carved into Grace's box, and he'd made it sturdy enough to last for generations. "Our grandchildren will sleep in this," he said as they set it up in the corner of the cabin. "Grandchildren," Grace repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." Their son was born on a warm day in late April, after a labor that lasted most of the night and into the morning. Mrs. Patterson served as midwife, her experienced hands guiding Grace through the pain, encouraging her, telling her she was strong, she could do this. Keegan stayed by Grace's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead, telling her he loved her over and over again. When the baby finally came, wailing and red-faced and perfect, Keegan caught him in his hands with tears streaming down his face. "A boy," Mrs. Patterson announced. "You have a son." Grace held her baby for the first time and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. This tiny person, barely an hour old, was hers and Keegan's, a family. "What should we name him?" Keegan asked, his voice rough with emotion. Grace had been thinking about this for months. "I want to name him after your father. What was his name?" "Henry," Keegan said softly. "Henry James Quaid. Then we'll call him James," Grace said. "James Henry Quaid, does that sound right to you?" "It sounds perfect," Keegan said. He leaned down and kissed first Grace, then the baby's downy head. "Welcome to the world, James. We're so happy you're here." The weeks after James's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning how to be parents, of stumbling through the new reality of life with an infant. But through it all, Grace felt a sense of rightness, of completion. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life, this sense of belonging, of family, of home. Keegan was a natural father, patient with the baby's crying, helpful with the middle-of-the-night feedings, utterly devoted to both his wife and son. He would come home from work exhausted and still insist on taking James so Grace could rest. He would walk the floor with the baby for hours, singing old mining songs his father had taught him, telling James stories about the life they would build together. As spring turned to summer, James grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby who seemed to bring joy everywhere he went. Mrs. Patterson doted on him, as did Dutch Hendricks and the other people in Downieville who'd come to know and respect Grace and Keegan. The men who had once made Grace's life difficult had either left town or learned to leave her alone, and Grace no longer felt the constant anxiety that had plagued her before Keegan arrived. One evening in July, almost exactly a year after the day Keegan had fixed Grace's door, they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset. James was asleep in Grace's arms, and Keegan had his arm around her shoulders. The air was warm and fragrant with the smell of pine and wildflowers. "Do you ever think about that day?" Grace asked quietly. The day we met. I think about it all the time, Keegan said. How close I came to just riding past, to deciding it wasn't my business, to not getting involved, and then I think about everything I would have missed. You, James, this life we've built, it terrifies me how different everything could have been. I think about it too, Grace said. How scared I was, how alone I felt, and then you appeared like some kind of answer to a prayer I didn't even know I'd been praying. You were never alone, Keegan said. Even before I showed up, you had so much strength, so much courage, you would have been fine without me. Maybe, Grace said, but I'm so glad I didn't have to be. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Grace said, I've been thinking about something. You know how you wanted to build us a bigger house? I do, Keegan said. Why? I think we should start planning for it, Grace said. Not right away, but soon. Maybe next year when we've saved a bit more. Because I think James is going to need more space eventually, and I think his brothers and sisters will too. Keegan turned to look at her, his eyes wide. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Not yet, Grace said with a smile, but someday. I want more children, Keegan. I want a house full of love and laughter and life. I want to give our children all the things we never had. Then that's exactly what we'll do, Keegan said. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. We'll build the biggest, best house in Downieville. We'll fill it with children and love and everything good. I promise you that. You always keep your promises, Grace said softly. Always. Keegan agreed. Over the next year, they saved every penny they could spare. Keegan took on extra work when it was available, building furniture for people in town, repairing roofs and fences, and anything else that needed fixing. Grace continued working at the boarding house, though Mrs. Patterson had reduced her hours and increased her pay, insisting that a new mother needed time with her baby. By the following spring, they had enough saved to start planning the house. Keegan spent weeks drawing up plans, showing them to Grace, making changes based on her suggestions. The house would have 4 bedrooms upstairs, a large kitchen and living area downstairs, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It would be built on a piece of land just outside town that Keegan had purchased, with a view of the mountains and the river. Construction began in May, and the entire town seemed to get involved. Dutch Hendricks provided lumber at cost. Other men from the sawmill volunteered their time on weekends. Mrs. Patterson organized meals for the workers, and Grace cooked alongside her, feeding the small army of people who'd come to help. The frame of the house went up first, strong wooden beams that seemed to reach toward the sky. Then the walls, the roof, the floors. Keegan worked from dawn until dark, and Grace would bring James to the building site so he could watch his father work, so he could be part of this creation of their home. By August, the house was finished. It was beautiful, bigger than anything Grace had ever imagined she might own, solid and well-built and perfect. Keegan carried her across the threshold on moving day, James balanced on his hip, and Grace looked around the empty rooms and saw them filled with all the life they would contain. They furnished the house slowly, piece by piece. Keegan built most of the furniture himself, solid oak pieces that would last a lifetime. Grace sewed curtains and quilts, made the house into a home with small touches that reflected both their personalities. They planted a garden, fruit trees that would take years to mature, but would someday provide apples and pears for their children. In October, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Keegan immediately, unable to contain her joy. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around their new kitchen, both of them laughing, James clapping his hands and giggling at his parents' happiness. Their second child, a daughter, was born the following June. They named her Catherine Louise, and she had Grace's dark hair and Keegan's green eyes. James was nearly 2 years old by then, and he was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help, to hold her, to make her smile. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace and Keegan had 2 more children, another boy named Thomas, and then a second daughter named Eleanor. The house that had seemed so big when they first moved in gradually filled with the noise and chaos and joy of a growing family. Keegan's reputation as a carpenter grew, and he eventually opened his own shop in town, building custom furniture that people came from as far as Sacramento to buy. Grace started a small business of her own, selling baked goods and preserves, her reputation for excellent cooking spreading throughout the region. They prospered in ways that went beyond money. Their children grew strong and healthy, surrounded by love and security. James showed an early talent for working with wood like his father. Catherine had her mother's beautiful voice and loved to sing. Thomas was the adventurous one, always exploring, always finding new places to climb and things to investigate. Eleanor was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, always mediating between her siblings. Mrs. Patterson remained a fixture in their lives, a surrogate grandmother to the children, a dear friend to both Grace and Keegan. She eventually sold the boarding house and moved into a small cottage near their property, spending her final years surrounded by the family she'd helped bring together. On a warm July evening in 1882, 10 years after the day they'd met, Grace and Keegan sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James was 12 now, tall and lean like his father. Catherine was 9, Thomas 7, Eleanor 5. They were playing some complicated game that seemed to involve running and shouting and a great deal of laughter. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Grace said, her hand in Keegan's. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Keegan said. "Sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "I know what you mean," Grace said. She looked at the life they'd built, the children they'd raised, the home they'd created. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? You said I'd have a lock and a home before night." "I do remember," Keegan said. "You gave me so much more than that," Grace said. "You gave me safety and love and a family. You gave me everything I'd ever dreamed of and things I never knew I could dream of." "You gave me all of that too," Keegan said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You gave me a reason to stop wandering, a place to put down roots, a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me a life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Catherine started singing one of the songs Grace had taught her, and the other children joined in, their voices blending together in harmony. "This is what happiness looks like," Grace said softly. "Yes," Keegan agreed. "This is exactly what it looks like." As the stars began to appear overhead, the children came running up to the porch, breathless and tired from their play. They piled onto the porch swing with Grace and Keegan, a tangle of arms and legs and laughter, and Grace felt her heart swell with love so profound, it was almost painful. "Tell us the story," Catherine said. "Tell us how you and Papa met." Grace and Keegan exchanged a look, and Grace began the story she'd told many times before. "Once upon a time, your papa was a cowboy riding through the mountains, and your mama lived alone in a little cabin on the edge of town. And some bad men broke Mama's door," James added, knowing the story by heart. "That's right," Grace said. "And Mama was scared and didn't know what to do, but then Papa came riding up on his horse and he said something that changed Mama's whole life." "What did he say?" Eleanor asked, even though she'd heard the story 100 times. Grace looked at Keegan, at the man who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her, who'd given her the world and asked for nothing in return but her love. "He said, 'You'll have a lock and a home before night.' And he kept that promise, just like he's kept every promise since." "And then they fell in love," Catherine said with a sigh. "And then we fell in love," Keegan confirmed. "The most important thing I've ever done in my entire life was stop to help your mother that day. Because that decision led to all of this. To you, to our home, to our family, to everything that matters." Thomas yawned and Grace smiled. "I think it's time for bed," she said. There were the usual protests, but eventually the children filed inside, heading upstairs to their bedrooms. Grace and Keegan tucked each one in, kissing foreheads and whispering good nights, moving through the ritual they'd performed thousands of times. When the house was finally quiet, they returned to the porch. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead. Keegan pulled Grace into his arms and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said. "More now than I did 10 years ago, which I didn't think was possible." "I love you too," Keegan said. "Forever, Grace, in this life and whatever comes after." They stood there holding each other under the stars, and Grace thought about the girl she'd been 10 years ago, alone and frightened, standing beside a broken door. She thought about how far she'd come, how much she'd gained, how completely her life had transformed. That girl would never have believed this was possible. A loving husband, healthy children, a beautiful home, a thriving business, respect in the community, safety and security and love beyond measure. But it had all happened, one day at a time, one moment at a time, building and growing like the house Keegan had built with his own two hands. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd stopped to help a stranger who'd made a promise and kept it, who'd seen worth in her when she'd been struggling to see it in herself. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "For what?" Keegan asked. "For fixing my door," Grace said. "For giving me a home. For loving me, for everything." Keegan held her tighter. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering carpenter with nothing but his tools and his word. Thank you for building this life with me." They stayed on the porch until the moon rose high in the sky, talking about their plans for the future. James would need apprenticing soon, and they'd been discussing him working with Keegan in the shop. Catherine wanted to start a choir at the church. Thomas had been talking about the new school being built in town. Eleanor wanted a kitten, simple plans, everyday concerns, the substance of a life well lived. Nothing dramatic or extraordinary, just the steady accumulation of love and joy and family. And to Grace, it was more precious than any treasure, more valuable than any fortune. The years continued to pass, bringing with them both joys and sorrows as all lives do. Grace's children grew into adults, found loves of their own, started families. James married a kind woman named Sarah and took over Keegan's carpentry business. Catherine married a teacher and moved to Sacramento but visited often with her growing brood of children. Thomas became a surveyor, traveling throughout California but always coming home. Eleanor married a rancher and settled just outside Downieville, close enough that Grace saw her nearly every day. Grace and Keegan became grandparents many times over, their house once again filling with the sound of children's laughter, albeit smaller children this time, visiting with their parents. They delighted in spoiling their grandchildren, in passing on stories and traditions, in watching the family they'd created continue to grow and flourish. Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 78, and Grace and Keegan mourned her deeply, grateful for all she'd done for them. They named their first granddaughter after her, ensuring her memory would live on. As Grace and Keegan entered their 50s and then their 60s, they slowed down but never stopped. Keegan's hands weren't quite as steady as they once were, but he still built beautiful furniture, teaching his craft to James and to several of his grandsons who showed an interest. Grace's hair turned silver and her face lined with age, but her smile was still as bright as it had been the day she married Keegan. They took to sitting on their porch every evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands and reflecting on the life they'd built. Their children and grandchildren would visit, filling the house with noise and life, but Grace's favorite moments were still these quiet evenings with Keegan, just the two of them together. "Do you have any regrets?" Grace asked one evening. They were in their late 60s by then, their bodies bearing the marks of a life well lived, hard worked, and fully experienced. "Not a single one," Keegan said. "You, not one," Grace agreed. "I've been so lucky, Keegan, luckier than I ever thought possible." "Not luck," Keegan said. "We made this life, Grace, together, through hard work and love and never giving up on each other. That's not luck, that's choice." Grace nodded, knowing he was right. They'd chosen each other every single day for decades. They'd chosen to work through difficulties, to support each other, to build something lasting and real. And that choice had made all the difference. On a summer evening in 1909, 37 years after they'd first met, Grace and Keegan celebrated their anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The house was full to bursting with family. 3 generations gathered to honor the love that had started it all. James, now a respected carpenter in his own right with silver threading through his hair, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice strong and clear, "who taught us what love looks like in action, who showed us that a good life is built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, who gave us a foundation so strong that everything we've built in our own lives rests on it. Thank you for everything you've given us. Thank you for being the best examples we could ever have." There were tears in many eyes as glasses were raised. Grace looked around at all the faces, at the family that had sprung from that moment 37 years ago when a cowboy had stopped to help a frightened young woman with a broken door. All of this life, all of these people, all of this love had stemmed from that single act of kindness. Catherine sang a song she'd written for the occasion, her voice still as beautiful as ever. Thomas told the story of how Grace and Keegan had met, embellishing it with humor and warmth. Eleanor presented them with a quilt she'd sewn, each square representing a different moment in their lives together, a patchwork of memories stitched with love. As the evening wore on and the younger children began to fall asleep, people gradually said their goodbyes and headed home or to the various rooms where they'd be staying for the night. Finally, it was just Grace and Keegan again, sitting on their porch as the moon rose over the mountains. 37 years, Grace said, marveling at the number. Sometimes it feels like we just met yesterday, other times it feels like we've been together forever. Both things are true, Keegan said. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture they'd repeated countless times over the decades. "Every day with you is a gift, Grace, every single one. You're the one who gave me gifts," Grace said. "Starting with that first night when you fixed my door and gave me back my sense of safety, you've been giving me gifts every day since. We've given them to each other," Keegan said. "That's what love is, I think. A constant exchange of gifts, some big and some small, until you can't even tell anymore who's giving and who's receiving because it's all just flowing back and forth between you." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence. The night was peaceful, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of the roses Grace had planted decades ago. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, an owl called out its hunting cry. "I'm tired," Grace said softly, "but it's a good tired, the tired of a life fully lived." "I know what you mean," Keegan said. "I'm tired too, but I'm happy, Grace, so deeply, profoundly happy." They sat there for a long time, not needing to talk, just being together. Eventually, they made their way inside and up to the bedroom they'd shared for decades. They helped each other prepare for bed with the casual intimacy of a lifetime together, then lay down side by side. "Good night, my love," Keegan said, pulling Grace close. "Good night," Grace replied, her hand resting over his heart. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and their dreams were of all the days they'd shared and all the love they'd known. Grace and Keegan lived for many more years after that anniversary, continuing to be a cornerstone of their family and their community. They grew older but never lost the love that had sustained them through decades. When Keegan finally passed away at the age of 82, it was peacefully in his sleep, Grace holding his hand. The grief nearly broke Grace, but she was surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them supporting her, holding her up, reflecting back to her the love she and Keegan had taught them. She lived for 5 more years after Keegan's death, and while she missed him every single day, she never felt alone. He was in every room of the house they'd built together, in every piece of furniture he'd made, in every child and grandchild who carried forward the values he'd instilled. When Grace passed away peacefully at the age of 84, she was buried next to Keegan in the Downieville cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the town where their story had begun. Her children placed a stone marker over their graves with a simple inscription, "Grace and Keegan Quaid. Together forever, a life built on love." The house they'd built still stood decades later, occupied by various descendants, always maintained with love and care. The story of how Grace and Keegan met became family legend passed down through generations. Parents told their children about the cowboy who stopped to help a stranger with a broken door, about the promise he made and kept, about the love that grew from that single act of kindness. And in Downieville, which had grown and changed over the years but never entirely lost its small-town character, older residents still remembered Grace and Keegan Quaid. They remembered Grace's kindness, her strength, the way she'd overcome hardship to build something beautiful. They remembered Keegan's skill as a carpenter, his integrity, the way he'd treated everyone with respect. But most of all, they remembered the love between them, a love so strong and true that it had inspired everyone who witnessed it. The broken door that had brought them together was long gone, replaced multiple times over the years. But the lock Keegan had installed that first night, the lock he'd promised Grace she would have before nightfall, was preserved by the family. James had removed it carefully when they'd eventually renovated the old cabin, and it had been passed down through generations, a tangible reminder of how their family had begun. Grace's carved wooden box, the first gift Keegan had made for her, also survived, cherished by her descendants as a symbol of their great-grandfather's love and craftsmanship. Inside, they found letters Grace and Keegan had written to each other over the years, documenting their love, their struggles, their joys, their unwavering commitment to each other and their family. The legacy Grace and Keegan left wasn't measured in wealth or fame, but in love multiplied across generations. Their children and great-grandchildren carried forward the lessons they'd taught through their example. That kindness matters, that promises should be kept, that love is the foundation on which everything meaningful is built, that home is not just a place, but the people who fill it with warmth and safety and belonging. In the end, Grace had been right when she told Keegan on their 10th anniversary that he'd given her everything she'd ever dreamed of, and things she never knew she could dream of. But what she couldn't have known then was how much further that gift would extend, how their love would create ripples that spread out across time, touching lives not yet lived, inspiring stories not yet told. It had all started with a broken door and a cowboy who stopped to help, who made a promise and kept it. A promise that became a courtship that became a marriage that became a lifetime of love, and a lifetime of love that became a legacy that would never die. Because true love, the kind Grace and Keegan shared, doesn't end with death. It lives on in the hearts of those who witnessed it, in the family it created, in the example it set. It becomes part of the story we tell ourselves about what's possible, about how life can surprise us, about how a single moment of kindness can change everything. And somewhere in Downieville, California, on quiet summer evenings when the sun sets behind the mountains and the air is sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the echo of laughter from a porch that no longer exists, the sound of children playing in a yard grown quiet, the whispered words of two people who loved each other more than they loved anything else in the world. "You'll have a lock and a home before night," a voice seems to say on the wind, and another voice full of love and gratitude and joy replies, "You gave me so much more than that, you gave me everything." That's the story of Grace and Keegan Quaid, a story that began with broken wood and fear and loneliness, and ended with love multiplied across generations. A family built on the strongest foundation possible, and two souls who found each other against all odds and never let go. It's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth believing in. Because it's a reminder that in a world that can be harsh and unforgiving, in a time and place where life was hard and survival uncertain, love could still flourish. Kindness could still make a difference. One person could still change another person's entire world with a simple promise, simply kept. And perhaps that's the most important lesson Grace and Keegan's story teaches us. That we all have the power to be that person for someone else, to be the one who stops when others pass by, who offers help when it's needed, who makes a promise and keeps it, who changes a life simply by caring enough to try. We all have the power to build something beautiful from something broken, to create a home where before there was only shelter, to transform fear into safety and loneliness into love. That power is in each of us, waiting to be used. All we have to do is choose to stop, to help, to care, to love. All we have to do is make the promise and keep it. And everything else, all the joy and beauty and meaning that makes life worth living, will flow from that choice like water from a mountain spring, pure and clear and life-giving. This is the legacy of Grace and Keegan Quaid, written in love and built to last forever.